Kia ora and welcome to Yarn Live, the Burnout Session. I'm Ryan the Lion, your host, and our special guest today is Sean Bowler, registered psychologist and MSc in neuroscience, who also works in organizational, therapy, and that is a real thing, but organizational psychology and a range of other areas, which you'll no doubt hear about shortly in a moment when he introduces himself. But just to take a second, this is our third in a series of four. We had our first two guests, which are Satyajit Radhashankar and Gareth Beck, talk about their lived experiences of burnout. I myself have been through the cycle 3 times, and it's and not to the full end. But this is why we're talking about it, to help shine a light on it, give people the exposure, awareness, and experience, and as through our series, some lived experiences. And now we're getting into the professional perspective with a psychologist here with Sean. So thank you very much for being with us today, Sean. Really appreciate it. How are you going?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today, Ryan.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's start off in true AFQY style, asking you to introduce yourself so we can meet the person a little bit. And that's not just your professional background related to what we're going to talk about today, but, what are you into outside of work? So over to you to what you'd like to share, and then we'll get into the discussion around
question. I love that question. I've got far too many hobbies. I'm actually a passionate scuba diver, and I had the wonderful opportunity to go and live in the Solomon Islands and do some volunteer work abroad recently, right up to the COVID pandemic. And guess what? Every time I wasn't doing what I was doing for the volunteer work, I was scuba diving. So yeah, that's kind of one of the things that spins my buttons.
Yeah, cool.
But I live here in Tamaki Makaurau, and I'm a psychologist, and I'm passionate about neuroscience, as I think you probably indicated through having studied a bit of it. And I love the connection between body and brain.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We won't get into this story, but I've always loved the idea of scuba diving, but am a little bit hydrophobic, so never learned to swim properly. Apparently have a great stroke technically, but after 20 meters, I start floundering around, so I could never do the 400-meter swim to get my scuba license. But let's get into burnout, because that's what we're really here to talk about. So we've got a couple of big questions that we'll start discussions with, and as we go through, we'll just chat away with them. So let's start with the pretty obvious or basic starting point of what is burnout? What's the official definition, and what are the causes? If you could share with everybody, give us a picture.
Yeah, absolutely. What is burnout? As a psychologist, I love starting off with what is it, because we just love operational definitions. What are we talking about here? Burnout is, what is it? World Health Organization is an organization you might have heard a little bit about in the news over the last 2 or 3 years. In fact, Absolutely. You'd be hiding under a rock if you hadn't. And they describe it not as an official diagnosis in the, like influenza or COVID-19 or schizophrenia. It's what they call a workplace syndrome, But, I liken it to a pandemic. I liken it to a global pandemic, because there is this huge pandemic of stress, and stress is a key driver of burnout. And the funny thing is that when we actually have burnout, it's a lot like having COVID. We start withdrawing from other people. We find it difficult to breathe. It's hard to exercise. We feel unwell. We're worried. And it starts to affect those around us. So it is, to me, it's like a global epidemic. How can you tell you've got it? I think there are 3 key signs to burnout. And the first one is exhaustion. And I'm not just talking about coming home from work tired at the end of the day. That's natural. I'm talking about exhaustion that goes right into your bones. Okay. Somebody described it as, when you've got burnout and you've got the exhaustion that goes with burnout, it's like even your tired is tired.
Yeah.
I love that, because it describes that terrible sensation of you just can't get over it. You can't get enough sleep. You can't take enough holidays. The second key sign of burnout, and what it looks like, is you get this disengagement, cynicism, withdrawal from the organization. you start to become very cynical about things like, oh, they're doing another round of, what are our corporate values kind of thing. And you really can't engage with all that stuff, but it goes much, much deeper. And if you're actually in a caring profession like nursing, they actually have a name for it, and they call it compassion fatigue. So instead of seeing these beautiful people that you want to help, and why you became a nurse, you just see another body there, another person in the queue, another bed in the corridor that I don't have time to deal with. And they call that compassion fatigue. So firstly, the exhaustion. Secondly, the cynicism, compassion fatigue, disengagement. And the third key thing is your productivity goes way down. You just can't get done what you used to get done. So those three things, exhaustion, cynicism, disengagement, and just can't get things done is what makes up this workplace syndrome, as the World Health Organization calls it.
Yeah. So a couple of those have been shared by Gareth and Savage and experienced myself, that exhaustion. So for me, I couldn't understand why I just could not get out of bed. And I initially thought it was anxiety and depression. So I put the tools to use that I'd been taught how to deal with that. And one of them actually was pushing yourself to do a little bit more work, because I got the feeling of achievement. So whether it was out in the garden or actually, business work, I did a bit more to get the feeling of achievement. And of course, that's just like putting a flame to the petrol, really.
That's
The
right.
wrong thing to do. Yeah. And that disengagement and cynicism, I was somewhat aware of it, but didn't realize how bad it was. But I got sent a article by a friend, and my initial response, it was over LinkedIn, my initial response was, "Why'd you send me that?" And the response was, "Did you read the section, third paragraph in the article? Kind of explains it." And why I didn't say anything was, I didn't want you to take my head off, because at the last AFQY, the events that I run, that you've been to back a few years ago, he said the Ryan I spoke to then was not the Ryan I know. So this cynicism, this disengaged, and I become very snappy and not very friendly, I guess, and that productivity drop. So that brain fog, that feeling of it sort of bleeds in with the exhaustion somewhat. But Gareth Beck talked about, in a second session, about how you force yourself to do something, but it still takes you half an hour to write one line in an email. But you like push your brain to work through it, and you don't understand why you can't type out the, "Hi Sean, how was your day? Hope you're well. Here's the attached document about burnout." You just can't write it. Can't do a simple thing. So, if anyone out there is listening and going, "Oh, I've been experiencing some of those things, but I thought it was something else," then perhaps it's time to talk to someone like Sean. So, yeah, that gives us a pretty good rundown. Is there anything that is, like you talked about for nurses in particular and compassion fatigue? Are there any other industry-specific examples or terminology that are worth sharing for the benefit of the audience, picking up on it? And
well, the corporate world obviously has a huge number of ways of talking about things. Bring your A game, and I guess when you're not bringing your A game, that's kind of, and you deep down you're not bringing your A game, and you look at something like taking 10 minutes to write an email that might have taken you 30 seconds previously. Those are pretty good signs. I'm not aware of any specific other logo. I think the work that was done by in nursing, a lot of that was done here in Auckland, actually, by the University of Auckland, was very specific to nursing. But look, this cuts across, and I want to make the point, not only all occupations and all workplaces potentially, but you can get burnout outside of work for different causes, if you're a carer, primary caregiver, and so on. But it's a pretty universal phenomenon, however you want to, whatever you want to label it as.
Yeah, so those three key things of exhaustion, cynicism, or disengagement, and productivity are the key indicators. So if we could now look at what is happening to the mind and brain, like you hold an MSc in neuroscience, you're a registered
Mm,
psychologist. This is
mm,
like where we start getting into what I call the mechanics of how it works. So when I went to my first counselling session, I was very scared and apprehensive, as most people are. And this is going back quite a few years. But the beauty of when I walked out is I'd had this thing called the Cartman triangle explained to me regarding bullying. And I likened it to going to your mechanic and saying, why is the car not working? And they go, oh, well, there's a problem with the gearbox. So we've been able to fix that and tweak the carburetor and, work with the crankshaft. And now we've got it running nicely. So this is why I call it the mechanics, because I feel
mm.
like we walk away with this understanding, which typically, and all the people I've spoken to, like Gareth, like Sarthajith and other friends, it gives people this understanding that enlightening is not quite the word. I don't know. It alleviates a lot of the pressure and fear of the unknown, I guess. So,
Mm,
with
mm.
that, could you tell us a bit more about the mechanics and neuroscience?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm going to put my cards on the table and tell you, Ryan, I don't believe you can separate the mind and the body. And when I'm trading, my business cards say Sean Bowler, body and mind, because those two things are really tied up. So what's going on in our body, and more specifically our brains, definitely dictates our state of mind, our psychological health, and our behavior. That's very much my belief. So if you think about what you're talking about, taking a long time to do an email, that's where a case of you're trying to do this mind over matter. I should work harder. I must be perfect. I must reply. I must be on my A game or whatever. And your mind is trying to control your body or your brain. Or your brain's part of your body, but you just can't, you see. And that's because when you've got burnout, your body is really getting hammered. The body and the brain is really getting hammered. So
Yeah.
what is happening? To understand what's happening with burnout in your body and your brain, you have to understand stress response. So I guess, Ryan, you'd understand the fight or flight response. That's something that
Yes.
pretty much most people have come across. So that's kind of like something happens, a stressor comes along, a car's coming when we don't expect it round the corner, and all of a sudden our heart rate goes up, our muscles tense up, and we get this release of adrenaline coursing through us, ready to fight, flight, do whatever we have to survive. Right? It's a very ancient reflex, right? So that's what's happening on a daily basis when you're in stress. Now, then you add on another secondary stress response, and it's a slower stress response. But when those stresses keep going on and on and on, you get this thing called the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the HPA axis, which we shorten it to for obvious
Okay.
reasons,
Yeah.
right? Starts to kick in. And this is like a much slower threat detection system. But when we've got this chronic fight or flight thing going on, the HPA axis kicks in and we start to release different hormones, not adrenaline, but cortisol. And what that does is it's our body's way of trying to say, hey, buddy, we're in a bit of a bind. We need to get out of this situation or change something and make it better, because otherwise we're going to die, right? And so these two reactions to stress, the fight or flight response, the HPA axis, and the release of this hormone cortisol, stress hormone, is preparing us to do our damnedest to change our environment or escape over a period of sustained stress. And that's what we call the allostatic load, the allostatic load. Now, allostasis, I'm
Yeah.
getting really technical here. I hope this isn't
Oh,
too
go for it.
technical.
I was going to say, I heard that
Allostasis,
word a few months ago, allostatic
yeah,
load. So I'm with you. I'm
it's
following.
not good. It's not the same as Allosaurus, then, the old dinosaur. Allostasis is when we are trying to adapt to this ongoing change in our environment. So it might be workplace bullying, unrealistic job requirements, whatever's the stresses are that's being triggered. And, some other stuff going on home as well. And so we're trying to adapt to it. But what happens with burnout is you just can't adapt to it. The stresses are too much. And so you get the state called allostatic overload. And that's what physically leads to the exhaustion, physically leads to the cynicism, physically leads to the withdrawal and disengagement, and physically leads to you physically can't get things done, the lack of productivity. cognitively and physically and all the rest of it. So this allostatic overload is what's going on, and it builds up over weeks and months. This isn't something that just happens in a day, you're burned out. It goes on and on and on. When you can't escape for it, that's what's going on. Now, also what happens is your body mass index goes up, your cholesterol goes up, you get sleep disturbances, your brain starts to rewire in adaptation to the stress. And so you get all these changes going on, right?
Yeah.
And this is why, if you've got burnout, and we might come to this a bit later on, is you can't fix it overnight. It takes months. And sometimes in bad cases of burnout, it takes years to undo all that physical damage, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I see as a practitioner is people say, well, we talk about it, we decide there's an element of burnout there. There's ways you can, come up with that kind of opinion.
Yeah.
But then people say, perhaps if I took 2 weeks off, things will be better. I could get back to full productivity. And you say, well, how long has this been going on? And they say 10 years. And you say, well, two weeks is going to undo all the rewiring that's gone on in your brain and body in reaction to this allostatic overload. No way. It might take you a year, 2 years to physically get over this. But the good news is you can undo and reverse a lot of the negative changes that are physically associated with burnout.
That's really good to hear. So before we get on to that part, if I can say, when I mentioned at the beginning, I've been through 3 cycles. I'm actually currently in my 4th.
Sorry to hear
you might
that.
think maybe organising these 4 series about burnout was bloody stupid, adding it to my load of work. But I did that beforehand, and part of the situation is, one week I said to a client, while we're doing some work, and I said, and they know me, and I said, it feels like a switch is flicked. I really feel like I'm back to myself. I feel like I haven't felt like this for a long time, and that's why I know I'm back to being myself. I'm not, sort of on the journey towards it. I'm there. And I was so excited. And from that, I did 3 days from 8 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock at night, and then had a full weekend of doing work as well, not that much. And then went to an event and did social media commentary all through the day. And as I went through the day, it hit me, and I was writing posts. So I do the social commentary and writing posts. And I was writing a post about what the speaker has said, while listening to the speaker and people talking to me about how do you write posts and how do you do this and all this. And everything just came to that grinding halt. So that taking 10 minutes to write a single line in an email that we talked about before, it hit me, and I just saw my world come to a grinding halt, and I started to have the freak out, because I was like, what?
This
I
shouldn't
thought I
be
was
happening to me. Yeah.
And I've now likened it to a hamstring, right? So you pull a hamstring, or you do your hamstring properly, and it's a bad one. Then you repair it and do your rehab, and then you say rugby's my thing, could be football, could be whatever, but you're sprinting and you just feel it tweak a little bit. Or sometimes so I kind of liken it to that, but it's something to do with the mind, with burnout, right? So I've now got really accustomed to, and have been doing a little bit of experiment. So yesterday I had a really light day and lots of connection with people and nature. But the day before it, I had quite a full-on day, and had been at a big meeting during the day, and then went to 2 different events, which was not uncommon for me. Go to an event from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and then go to another event from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. But I knew as I was driving to the second event that I should just drive home. But I said to myself, "No, I'm not at the end state here. I need to see what happens if I push my hammy. I need to just test it out, because I think this is going to happen." So sure enough, yesterday, which was the day after the events day, I had to just take a slow day. And what it was for me is sort of learning where that's at. But I think you'll be probably pleased to hear that I'm not going to do this to myself again. I'm going to take it slowly so that I can fully recover, and then not do that sort of all-nighter type work again. I'm making some changes in my life as well as my lifestyle. So for people out there who are wondering, because that was one of my questions. I actually, you might have seen the story of Theresa Gatting. So she went to very extreme, had a physical collapse, and there's a great Sunday, TVNZ Sunday episode about it. She talks quite openly about it. So she accepted my invite, and I asked her the question, and I'll ask you as well. Did you ever get fully better back to yourself? Or do you still feel like you're limping with the potential of your hamstring pulling? I haven't got the answer yet, but I'm hoping to invite her onto the show as another lived experience. But the question to you, and I'll be quiet now because I haven't stopped speaking for a little bit, is you talked about you can reverse the effects. Can you actually totally get it back to who you were? Can you fully heal that hamstring? Verbal here.
Yeah. And look, I think there's a couple of things. Your answer, or what you've been saying, is really interesting, because that demonstrates a key point I wanted us to talk about.
Yeah.
And that is, well, what do you do about it? What can we do about it? Well, we can look at it from the employer's perspective, or the people who control the workplaces. And I think that's probably worthwhile. And we're talking about things like zero bullying policies, designing safe work that's psychologically safe. In other words, you can have some autonomy over what you're doing and how you're doing it. You're not working unreasonable hours and so on, etc. But then what can the individual do it? And McKinsey, the consulting firm, they did a really good article on burnout last year, which I've got. And
okay.
They said you can't yoga your way out of this. Employers and employees can't yoga your way out of it, because often what happens is the HR department decides, people are a bit stressed or whatever. Somebody's off on stress leave or burnout or whatever. I know, we'll put fruit in the tea rooms. We'll put fruit baskets in the tea rooms. I know, we'll hire a yoga teacher to come in and do yoga sessions at lunchtime and teach people to relax. You know what? That just puts more stress on the poor old employees, because what it's doing is it's saying, hey, if you get burnt out, it's not our fault. We gave you the fruit and the yoga, get back to work.
Wow.
See what I mean? So McKinsey say, look, you can't yoga your way out of this stuff. But what you talked about is you're talking about being more self-aware and self-regulating and being more mindful. And I think those are really good ways of learning to manage this. The second question, you talked about can you get totally back to normal? Well, burnout exists for a reason. I actually think there's a golden or a silver lining to burnout. And the silver lining is that it's nature's way of stopping us from killing ourselves in the office. Right? When we physically can't carry on working, it makes us withdraw and reassess, and we have to change something because something's not working. Whereas if we could just keep on working, we'd actually end up killing ourselves, working ourselves to death. So the silver lining is it's saying, and this might be true for Theresa Gatting, I can't speak for her, but she might have the observation that a lot of people have had. It was actually like a message for me that I needed to change my life. She might say something like that. So I don't want to go back to the way things were. Something's shifted. I've become more aware of what I need to do to keep well. And I think that's kind of what you were talking about in terms of, testing out your using that knee reconstruction analogy. Can I play a bit longer? Oh, no, that doesn't feel so good. Well, I'm going to back off. Well, maybe that's a habit you've got to have for life.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm just trying to remember, because there's been a range of interesting points I wanted to cycle back on. So I think I'm going to have to relax and let it come to me while we talk about another point. But the taking a step back and the basically listening to your body, listening to the message, and making life choices. So I have made some big changes. They haven't been announced yet, but if anyone who's watching this, there will be some major announcements coming out soon. and that has been deliberately related to my repeat cycles of burnout. I recognise that something had to change, and I've identified it, and it's going to be happening shortly. I'll tell you personally off camera, but I won't jump the gun in terms of what's going to be announced. But
Sure.
yeah, you can't ignore the message, people. So we had Sardajiv. So Sardajiv was our first one, and he actually stopped working and has worked out how to exist without the incoming salary. And they've done things from mortgage holidays to using their savings, etc. Because that's the thing. How do you take the time off that you need to take off when you've actually got to work to earn money to pay the bills to live and survive in this world?
Tough questions.
Yeah, and that's one of the big challenges because yoga and fruit bowls are not going to help. It's actually initially for me it was rest. So when I first had it, I was going to a wedding over Easter, and you have that period where if you take the 3 days, if you're a full-time employee, you take the 3 days off in between, you get 2 to 3 weeks. So I use that time when there's a lot of people away from work anyway, just to basically, if there was anything I could not do or remove from my calendar, I did. So I didn't go to events that I wasn't paid to be engaged with. I didn't do meetings. I pushed stuff out, etc. And was lucky, and that helped me. But as I've gone through the 3 to 4 cycles, I've realized, well, look, I'm still doing stuff like that. I'm still tweaking the hammy. So I've got to make bigger changes. And that's going to be quite cool. But the article from McKinsey, we'll get that and pop that into the notes at some point. But yeah, I think I can't remember what it was. I did want to talk about allostasis and the allostatic load. So it was actually Heather Polgasi, who is the Chief People Officer from Spark, who wrote about it in a post. That's how I learned about it and had to Google it and do my Wikipedia. So just to touch on that, the allostatic load or overload is when you lose the ability to evolve. Oh, now I've got it. Cortisol. So in relation to what the allostatic load is, and the fact that it's you adapt, and when you get overload, you've lost the ability to adapt because you're pushing yourself too much to adapt.
Yeah, there's a difference between allostatic load and allostatic overload. Allostatic overload is what drives burnout because you just can't manage the situation. But everybody's carrying around some sort of allostatic load during the day.
And what the point is, I like to remind people is that cortisol gets tagged to anxiety and depression, and it's a bad thing. But the key point that I wanted to come back and get you to talk to more is the fact that it's actually designed to save us. So it's a really good thing. But when it's an overload, I guess, is the last thing I'll say, that's the bad thing that needs to be looked at. But
it's a steroid. Cortisol is a natural steroid. So I mean, what do athletes take if they want to perform at a really high level? They'll take, illegally, they'll dope and they'll take anabolic steroids, or cortisol is a steroid. It just happens to be produced by the body, and you get too much of it washing around, there's going to be negative effects.
Yeah, absolutely. So just looking at our, I think we've sort of touched on some of these bits, but maybe if we can just do a little bit more concentrated or focused and leave you to answer rather than me jumping in, is what is the course or range of treatment, an overview, so people who've never been to a counsellor can get an idea of what it's like if they're coming to work with you or other counsellors, but what are the types of things that we'll touch on or that you'll touch on, and give them an insight so they don't feel so fearful, they don't feel the stigma of the past, they actually feel quite excited about doing this.
Yeah, look, the first thing I'd say is if you feel that this sounds like it's something relevant to you, if this kind of overwhelming exhaustion and cynicism and lower productivity than normal is kind of pervasive, and the first thing is I'd say go see your GP, check that there's nothing physically wrong. And GPs, look, are really well positioned to understand and get you on the path to wellness because, they probably, a lot of them have first-hand experience of burnout. So, the medical profession is notorious for burnout. So they will recognize it, hopefully, and understand it and give you some breathing space and reassure you that there's nothing physically wrong. And then from there, it would help to sit down with somebody like myself and talk through, some of the factors around it, what's going on for you at work, what's going on for you at home, what changes you might want to make, where do you really want to be? And often there are some things that we can do. And when I talk working with people who function at a high level, which I do quite a lot of, we're talking about executives and professionals and so on. There's two things that really predispose for burnout. The first is imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome. And the second is perfectionism. Okay.
Right.
Wanting to get things really, really right, 100% right, 110% right. And those two things can predispose you hugely to burnout. Because with imposter syndrome, you're always trying to go harder because you're afraid of failing. You're afraid of being exposed for the fraud that this little negative voice in your head says that you are. So you just work harder and harder. And with perfectionism, it's kind of the same. You're desperate to get it 110% nailed. So you will give every project 110%. But the reality is that's a physical impossibility. There's only so many hours in the day. You've only got one body. It needs rest, recreation, fun, social connection. I think you mentioned all those protective, healthy habits factors. And so it's going to break down and you'll end up with burnout. So people who are perfectionist, conscientious, and people who have a little bit of imposter syndrome are the ones most predisposed to get it. The outlook is to change that thinking. Change that thinking that everything needs to be correct. Change that thinking that you are an imposter or a fraud, and that sooner or later you're going to get discovered. And that's where working with somebody like me who can coach you through some of those issues is really useful.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because look, we've got a first comment. So I've been putting in comments and time stamping, and there's the first one from Sherry around imposter syndrome, something that she relates to. And I know Sherry, she's worked as a CIO and tech leader, and has talked at AFQY around some of the challenges of being a woman in the IT industry, which is 80% male. And of course, there's no surprise in any industry, the stats around women in the higher level roles and the board, etc. So yes, and I can imagine imposter syndrome there. But coming back to the imposter syndrome and perfectionism, that imposter syndrome around, I want to just slightly frame it in an additional way. So not saying the original way is wrong, but an additional way is, if the first way is imposter syndrome, I'm going to be found out that don't know what I'm doing. I think there's a variation which for me is imposter syndrome, and it's going to be wrong, and not perfectionism, because I'll talk about that in a second, but you don't know what you don't know, so I'm going to do something wrong and not realize it, and that's going to come to the fore. And that's where the perfectionism connects, because you want to do things that were great, you want to do them right, you've always been a high achiever, now you're in a position where you're kind of guessing. It becomes a little bit awkward, a little bit hard. And here we've got another one. So Sandra's just joined, and I'm watching the numbers on my other screen over here. They've been quite high through the show, so it's good. There's lots of people watching, but no one asking questions. Maybe because I forgot at the beginning to say, feel free to ask questions and drop them into comments. Apologies, everyone. So do feel free to ask questions. But that's interesting. Those two things are a key part of it. So we're just sort of coming up. I just want to check time-wise. We're a couple of minutes over. Just want to check that you're okay for time, first of all, and that if you had potentially another 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, if you're asking me, absolutely fine. I'm not sure about the audience, but it's great to see this interaction. I just wanted to say, if we've got another couple of minutes, one thing I'd like to say, Sherry, really appreciated you sharing that openly, because 66% of women in the workplace have experienced imposter syndrome, feeling a bit of a fraud in the last year. Okay.
Wow.
50% of men. So it's not exclusively a female thing, but it does skew slightly female. But look, put it this way: most of us feel a fraud. It's kind of a universal thing. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not good for this, that drives the conscientious, drives the perfectionism to a certain extent. And so we need to rewire ourselves and rewire some of that inner talk to allow ourselves to be more tolerant of being a little bit half-assed about the things that really don't matter.
Yeah.
Being not giving 100% to every single project, or saying no to things, all these sorts of things. And these are the kind of the practical things that we can do, because as I've said, perfectionism is, well, there's actually three predisposing factors to to burnout from an individual perspective.
Yeah.
And that is perfectionism, conscientiousness, and caring about your work. Now, doesn't that sound like the perfect employee? The reality is, when you're burning out, it's probably because you're good.
Yeah.
But you don't see it like that. You just think, just like you said, Ryan, if I just work a little bit harder,
I'll feel better.
I'll be
Yeah.
even better. And then you get more burnout. That's how it works.
You just made
So
me
we've got to
think
get
of
rid of the
something.
faulty thinking about perfectionism in the first place to deal with it.
Thank you. And you just made me think of something I wanted to ask, because it may be another thing that people out there are wondering about, is what about being a people pleaser? So if you play people pleaser into perfectionism and imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome, you're thinking, oh, I'm not good enough. Don't know this stuff. I'm not, onto it. So you work harder to get things right. But that's perfectionism. And part of it is being a people pleaser. You don't want to let them down by being wrong or incapable. Just made me think for a little bit. But I'm only sort of guessing here. So I'll hand it over to you as the expert to comment on whether that's a real addition or just part of the existing perfectionism.
Yeah, look, it certainly can put added pressure on, and often this wanting to please other people is coming from a fear space. If I appease these people, then they'll just be a bit nicer to me. I'll just get a bit more acceptance and so on.
Yeah.
And a lot of this relates to the core beliefs of who we are, which is why psychology is really well placed to help people work through something like burnout, because we deal with things like core beliefs. Do you need to please everybody? Why? And what are your automatic thoughts when it comes to how well you need to do something? Are you going to be a failure if you do something wrong? Does that going to reflect badly on your whole personality? And so we need to really deal at these fundamental levels to make sure that we're not just constantly cycling through. You talked about cycling through burnout. If you're constantly cycling through burnout, then there are some individual factors in there that can contribute to it, particularly when, as you are, Ryan, you are self-employed. You set your own agenda. So, notwithstanding, there's probably certain constraints on that around the income that you want to achieve and all the rest of it. But if it keeps happening over and over again, then you've got to say, well, what is it about me that's predisposing me to these continued cycles? And maybe I need to do some work on myself.
Absolutely. And that comes back to that part that I talked about earlier of I had made adjustments, but they weren't enough. And you have to keep listening to that message that your body's giving you. So it's not just about putting the tools that I've been taught to help manage it, because that's what I've done and still gone through some cycles. And I think, being self-aware, I know that I have not listened to myself when I've gone hammer and tong or done too many things. I know that it's like, I could potentially push myself over, and of course it's going to. But now I am acutely aware. Maybe acutely is a bit this wrong word, but I am more accurately able to work out what will and what won't at the moment push me over and where I need to take it easy. So we've got another comment here. I'll just pop that up. This is Chris Stacey. This has been a great session. However, I've ticked all the boxes so far, so it might be time for a bit of a review. Well, I think that ironically is where we're at the stage of the show where I say to Sean, I'm going to give you a moment to collect your thoughts about closing remarks. What would you like to share as your closing remarks? And while I give you that time, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we've spoken about. So this is the 3rd in 4 episode series on burnout. The first 2 speakers, Satyajit Ravishankar and Gareth Beck, spoke about lived experiences. And Sean is the first to share from a professional perspective, being a registered psychologist and doing a lot of work in organizational psychology, corporate wellness, and leadership coaching. So you would have heard it. We'll come back to that in a moment. That's at the end of the summary. So coming back to the beginning, we first looked at what a definition of burnout was and how people could recognize it. And the 3 elements, which are exhaustion, cynicism or disengagement, and I think exhaustion was the 3rd one. I'm thinking of the first. Hang on, I've got them right here in my notes.
Exhaustion, cynicism, and decreased productivity. Finding it hard to get things. It's like wading through treacle.
Yeah. And then we looked at what are the things that people can do in terms of how they can manage it, how they can work with professionals, and have then looked at some of the finer bits and pieces around two of the aspects that are predispositions around perfectionism and imposter syndrome, and how they play into creating or a person who suffers from those, or I'll just say suffers with those, maybe not the best words, but how that all comes together as part of the burnout picture. And now come back to you, Sean, in terms of your closing remarks, and give us your final thoughts for everybody out there around burnout from the professional perspective, please.
Sure. Look, I'd say burnout comes from, I can't overemphasize how long it takes for burnout to build up. We're built for peak performance, for short sprints. But if this is something that's been building, and you recognize some of the things that we've been talking about through the series or through this particular session, I would say do reach out and don't expect to just wave a magic wand and turn it around. You need to spend some serious time looking at the patterns that got you to where you are. And if you're highly successful, it might have been 20 years or 30 years of patterns. And so that takes a lot of unwiring to learn this kind of self-habits and self-awareness that Ryan's talking about. You need a guide. First, check out whether it's anything physical with your GP, but then also think about who that guide's going to be to help you start to unlearn some of the stuff that got you into this situation in the first place.
Well said. Thank you very much. And that's it. I didn't realize that 20 to 30 years though, so I'm going to come back to that because I thought it was just, for me, it was all related to running an events business during COVID and being primary carer and a few other challenges in life. When I think about it,
can be take just a couple of years to develop burnout. But the point I was making is that if it's actually been part of a pattern that's been going on for much longer, it's going to take a length of time to unwind anyway. Yeah. So,
yeah, and I think
you can get burnt out in a year.
Some of the changes I've been making around it is actually to my personality of how I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I'll go and have a look at that. Oh, that's really cool. I'll go and have a look at that. And people actually have a word for it now. They call it a multi-potentialite, where a person likes doing a lot of things. But the problem with that is the context swapping between if I'm editing a video for a client to if I'm managing an event to if I'm doing some other piece of marketing work, and swapping the context between all of them. So the gig economy might be a discussion for another session, because we have had your closing remarks. I won't introduce more subjects, but there are certainly more to talk about. So I'll wrap it up there, Sean, and say to everybody, thank you very much for those who've been watching live. Thank you very much to those who watch this later. There's a huge amount of really good information that Sean has shared from his professional perspective and taken us through the definition of burnout, what it is, what creates it, and the steps that you can take in terms of the process of seeing your GP and then seeking professional help from someone like Sean. So with that, we will say ka kite anō to everybody, and hopefully they got some great value out of it. And thank you very much for all of your time, Sean. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we'll stay on. So I'll end the broadcast for everybody, but if you stay on for a moment, that'd be great. Ka kite anō.